Hi there everyone. In the last video I talked about the age of exploration and set out the foundations for that. In this video I'm going to talk about conquest and settlement and how this exploration, this age of exploration, develops into Portuguese and Spanish empires. First item of business for the Spanish and the Portuguese, especially after Columbus' discovery of America, is who should influence which lands. Where should the Portuguese sphere of influence end and where should the Spanish influence end? And they go to the papacy to work out how they should divide the exploration of these lands between them. And the Pope at the time, Alexander VI, draws a line down the middle of the Atlantic. And he says everything east of this line is the Portuguese sphere of influence, everything west of this line is the Spanish sphere of influence. And so that means that Portuguese colonization and influence and exploration is going to take place in Africa and India and Asia, and also in Brazil because of the place in the Atlantic where the Pope draws that line. Not knowing about Brazil at the time. There's a conspiracy theory that the Portuguese already did and didn't say anything, but we don't know. But no further west than that, which is why Brazil is the only country in Latin America where Portuguese is the common language. And everywhere else in North and South America is going to be the Spanish sphere of influence. Now, of course, other exploration countries aren't going to respect this, but this is the demarcation line. This sets up these empires to be quite different. The Portuguese Empire, as I kind of alluded to in the last video, is based on trading enclaves down the coast of Africa and into India, where the Portuguese are doing business with the different local peoples, and they start to flex their muscles a little bit in terms of promoting rulers who are favorable to them, who are going to offer them favorable trading benefits, but they never have the power in comparison with these local rulers to establish control of these lands. So it remains a trading empire. One important aspect in the history of the Portuguese Empire is the Battle of Diu in 1509. This was the battle in which the Portuguese defeated the Ottoman Turks, which is a significant achievement. And in this naval battle, the Portuguese defeat the Ottomans and they establish their control and their influence over the Indian Ocean. And this is important for the continued history of our class, in which we're looking at the expansion of Western influence, because it means that the Indian Ocean will be under Western influence really right up until the present day. The Portuguese are going to dominate the Indian Ocean, and then the British are going to dominate the Indian Ocean. And so this is why the Battle of Diu, why the Portuguese Empire is so important. It spreads Western influence into the Indian Ocean and into particularly Southern Asia. Now we turn to Spain. Spain has a very different experience. Spain's exploration is going to result in a land empire. It's going to result in the conquest of empires and political rulers in the Americas and the establishment of a land empire that covers a large amount of territory. And the first of these conquests is the conquest of the Aztecs, led by Hernando Cortez and his conquistadors. Now, the Aztec Empire at the time was far larger, far more sophisticated than the Spanish Empire. But it's also a repressive empire that carries out large numbers of human sacrifices every year, where the people who are ruled by the Aztecs are taken up to the capital or other cities throughout the empire to be sacrificed. And so, although the Spanish are able to be very successful against the Aztecs because they have guns, because they have horses, and because they have steel, none of which the Aztecs have, they would certainly have been overwhelmed, because Cortez only had a few hundred men. They would have certainly been overwhelmed, except for the fact that they have a large number of Native American allies. By the time the final battle is fought, tens of thousands of Native Americans have chosen to fight for Cortez. And this very much gives the lie to the misconception that Cortez's conquest of the Aztec Empire was some kind of act of European oppression. Actually, it's the reverse, that most Native Americans, apart from the Aztecs, saw the Aztecs as such brutal rulers that they were willing to throw in their lot and take a chance on the Spanish, because they couldn't imagine worse rulers than the Aztecs. The other conquest of note in Latin America, carried out by the Spanish, is the conquest of the Incan Empire in Peru, another highly organized society where human sacrifice was present but not as central to its culture as it was to the Aztec Empire. And the Spanish conquistador here, his name is Francisco Pizarro, he takes advantage of an Incan civil war to establish his power in the kingdom. And so the Spanish become more and more important backers until the side with the Spanish on it is guaranteed to be successful. And then eventually the Spanish just start ruling the empire. The point is that this takes a long time. This takes about 40 years, and you have different Inca factions who are fighting one another, and the Spanish are allied with one or the other, and you have different Spanish factions who are fighting one against another. So again, it's not the case that the Europeans simply come in and dominate. It's a long and complex process of negotiation and development before the Spanish really take over rule of the Incan Empire. So these are the major conquests carried out by the Spaniards. What about Spanish rule and Spanish settlement of their new American empire? First, it begins with the encomienda system. And I think it's fair to say that this is very much based on the feudal system that the Spanish would have known in Europe. You have an encomendero, a Spanish settler, who's granted a certain amount of land from the Spanish government. And he is supposed to provide military protection for this land, and he is supposed to evangelize the native peoples in Christianity and provide them with education in Christianity. The native peoples who live on the encomienda received a wage, could not be bought or sold, and so were not seen as slaves, but the wage they received was very small, and so it was very difficult for them to become independent. And so they're much more like medieval serfs than they are slaves. And there are Spanish missionaries and Spanish leaders who are opposed to this system, that see this system as oppressive. And they convince the king and queen of Spain that this system is oppressive. And the Spanish king and queen try and remove the encomienda system. However, they are unable to. They are unable to because the Spanish settlers are simply too powerful and too far away from Spain. So although the Spanish king and queen say you have to get rid of the encomienda system, they don't have the authority actually to enforce this order, even though it seems as though they wanted to. What will kill the encomienda system in the end is European diseases. Diseases like measles and smallpox and typhoid that European bodies and Spanish bodies were used to and had developed immunity to were foreign to Native Americans and just ran amok through the Native American population. And it's estimated that as many as 90%, or as much as 90% of the American population dies as a result of these diseases. And so these lands are emptied and decimated. This is thought to contribute in some ways to the way the Spanish approached these lands, that they didn't see these lands as having been shaped by older cultures, that they saw these lands as totally unused and ready to be shaped by their own influence. It's also the case that the Spanish, because of the diseases that are decimating the Native American population, start to look for other sources of labor. The crops and the work that they're doing, if they're cultivating tobacco and sugar and silver mines, those require a lot of labor. And now the labor supply is disappearing. And the solution is the development of the Atlantic slave trade and the transportation of slaves from Africa to the New World to work on these Spanish lands. It's important to be aware of a couple of aspects of where this slave trade came from. The slave trade was not a European institution. There was little or no slavery in Europe at the time, certainly not agricultural slavery. So the institution of slavery comes from Africa. Remember that the Portuguese are trading with African kingdoms in the West. And one of the commodities that the African kingdoms are trading with the Portuguese are slaves captured in war. So this is where the institution comes from. What the Europeans provide is the technology to ship these slaves to the New World. And eventually the Spanish adopt this practice from the Portuguese as well. It's also important to be aware of the fact that at the time, this form of slavery, Atlantic slavery, was not based on race. It will become based on race. But in the 16th century, it's not to do with race. People aren't slaves because they are not white. We find that at a certain point, the English are going to not going to enslave Irish populations, white Irish populations, and send them over to the Caribbean, and they'll be treated in exactly the same way as the Africans. They'll be treated dreadfully, but there's no distinction between the way black and white slaves are treated. Similarly, these African kingdoms are not enslaving people from Africa because they are black. It's about being captured in war. It's about your social status. But at this time, it's not about your race. Okay, that's a background to Spanish settlement, Spanish labor relations, Spanish relations with the Atlantic slave trade, the encomienda system. The last topic that I want to touch on is the evangelization of the New World by the Spanish. As a result of being in close proximity with Muslim and Jewish communities throughout the medieval period, a big part of the Spanish education system during the medieval times was the learning of languages. And the Spanish put this to good use as part of their efforts to bring Christianity to the New World. We find that they are translating Christian texts like the Bible and catechisms into Native American languages. And because of this background in languages, because languages are such an important part of their education, they are well suited to learning these Native American languages and communicating with the Native Americans. And this helps spread Christianity. But what contributes most to the spread of Christianity and the acceptance of Christianity in the Americas is the cult of Our Lady of Guadalupe, this memory, this recollection that the Virgin Mary had appeared to a Native American Christian, one of the early Native American Christians. And this is really important because it comes across as that Christianity is something for both Native Americans and Spaniards and Europeans, that this isn't just a European religion, but that Native Americans have an important role to play in the development and the practice of this religion. And this leads to widespread acceptance and adoption of Christianity in Spanish colonies in the New World.